Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Today we're very pleased to welcome Dr John Lourdusamy, who is from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in the Indian Institute of Technology in Chennai. And Dr Lourdusamy originally did his DPhil in Oxford in history, but since that time his interests have broadened considerably, and I'm looking at his CV only this morning, and has an incredibly broad range of interests, which include the development of sort of locally, rurally relevant technology in different parts of India as well, and some very interesting research on rural development in India. And so he's not only a historian who's done a huge amount of work on the history of medicine and science in India, but also has these interesting other activities as well. He's written a number of books, including Science and National Consciousness in Bengal, 1870 to 1930, and also Religion and Modern Science in Colonial Bengal, which of course are titles very relevant to our topic today. So we're looking forward to his talk very much on science and religion in colonial India, a historical perspective. So thank you very much.
A lectern is on its way.
Thanks, Dennis, for those nice words of introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. Basically, in this paper, I try to provide insights on the elite response to modern science in colonial Bengal, insofar as they saw modern science as a threat or companion to pursuit of religion as such. The paper draws qualified parallels between these positions of these elite intellectuals and the religion-science connections at the advent of modern science in the Western world itself. One sees interesting trends in blending the enthusiasm for modern science smoothly with the redeployment of that very science itself as another key element in the indigenous socio-religious reform movements that were contemporaneously underway. The interlocutors went one step further to highlight how modern science itself would be much poorer and non-holistic without the tempering role of religion. We also see serious concerns being raised about the direction of modern science at large, and yet sanguine hopes raised about India's possible contribution to a more holistic version of what was seen as despiritualized materialistic science coming from the West. The paper ends by underlining the relevance of all this to the present day world with its ecological and other crises related to the direction and orientation of modern science in the last couple of decades. To start with, the advent of modern science in India was significantly mediated through men of science and religious institutions. Some of the early centers of scientific education, for instance, in Bengal happened to be institutions set up by them. For instance, the Baptist Missionaries Serampur College in Srirampur, or the Jesuit St. Xavier's College in Calcutta. But the mainstream larger flow of science, of course, happened through the colonial institutions and societies. Now, how did the intelligentsia respond to these openings, given the strong religious traditions and the abiding presence of religion in common life in India? The local intelligentsia, comprising of socio-religious reformers and scientific men, felt that religion need not have to be compromised to acquire modern science. On the contrary, modern science itself was advocated in religious idioms and metaphors and presented as yet another way of realizing God. Men like Rajaram Mohan Roy, who was the founder of the Brahmo Samaj reform movement, felt that the aim of the reform movement was not only to amend religious practices, but also in the process prepare the way for scientific pursuits with an open mind. The social reformer and educationist Akshay Kumar Datta famously declared that India needed a Bacon, Francis Bacon he meant. Yet he presented science in highly religious terms while emphasizing on the human mind's enormous capabilities in understanding the universe. He felt that it would be a wrongly conceived notion to look down on the physical world in comparison to the spiritual. Hence, he sought to dispel the popular notion of Maya, according to which the external phenomenal world was an illusion. He insisted that, on the contrary, the material world revealed the benevolence of the Supreme Being. He stressed on the organic unity of the world, in which everything had its own specific character and purpose, and it related to all others around. Datta attributed this coherence to the infinite wisdom and goodwill of God. However, the laws governing them were not beyond human understanding. It is here that science played its role in helping to better understand, I quote, the laws of the world by which God seeks to govern everything, unquote. Thus, Datta sought to further the acceptability of science by investing it with sacred values. In his works, he exhorted his readers to explore the divine purposes as expressed in the laws of nature. From here on, we'll find the reformers' thoughts echoing trends we see with some of the early modern scientists in the West who saw their work as glorifying God or as unveiling God's boundless powers or God's love of man in investing him with the capacity to unveil the mysteries of nature. At a more practical level, Datta advocated the imparting of the rudiments of science to students at a very early age, and he himself played a very valuable role in the teaching of science. He taught physics and geography at the Tattva Bodhini Pathsala, founded in 1840. He also emphasized the role of the mother tongue in the propagation of scientific knowledge. Thus, we see that one of the earliest figures of India who not only advocated modern science, but also did human service in that direction practically, saw a sacred function for science and presented science before his countrymen as a mode of understanding God better. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, a contemporary of Datta, and yet another social reformer and educationist, had very strong Sanskrit and traditional foundations. Yet he, in spite of his attachment to the ancient lore, ardently advocated the acceptance of modern science. Vidyasagar was trained in the Sanskrit College, and he worked there for many years apart from the Fort William College, set up by the British colonial establishment. With all his undoubted commitment to tradition, he condemned, I quote, the bigotry of the learned of India, who cultivated the tendency to ridicule any truth advanced by European science, unquote. He deplored the fact that even when such men heard of a scientific truth which could in some way be related to the ancient lore, they, I quote, instead of showing any regard for that truth, acquired a triumphal attitude that only redoubled the superstitious regard for the ancient lore. He warned of the dangerous attitude on some quarters to find the root of all modern scientific discoveries in some ancient Indian text or the other. This tendency and self-satisfaction only hardened their superstitions, according to Vidyasagar. He highlighted the negative effect that superstitions had on the advancement of modern science and campaigned vigorously against them as an educationist and reformer. He was also very much in favor of communication of scientific knowledge through the mother tongue and advocated the establishment of vernacular schools which would impart a complete course of elementary education that included, I quote, elements of natural philosophy, meaning chemistry and physics, and natural history, unquote. He himself started and ran many vernacular institutions. He opened a school to prepare qualified teachers for teaching science in the vernacular institutions. Interestingly, it was Akshay Kumar Datta, who I referred to earlier, was appointed as the headmaster of that school. Keshub Chandra Sen was yet another reformer who presented science in deeply religious metaphors. He urged that science should be taken with warm, enthusiastic love as it was, I quote, God's scripture, written by his own hand, infallible and sacred, unquote. Science was not to be looked, I quote, as a mere record of wonderful discoveries and inventions, or at best an exposition of fixed mechanical laws, but as revelations of the power and love of God, unquote. Sen noted that there might be men who saw science as a mere record of wonderful discoveries and inventions, or at best an exposition of fixed mechanical laws, and gave glory to Laplace and Newton and not to the Lord of creation. However, each law, each force, design, and contrivance could in fact raise one to a higher spiritual realization beyond mere intellectual interest. I quote, anatomy and physiology, geology and astronomy, chemistry and zoology were living preachers that spoke forth saving wisdom, unquote. When one read even the smallest science primer, fact after fact, one, I quote, cannot help bowing before the throne of the Almighty God and magnifying His name, unquote. Sen hoped that the young and the old would assiduously and reverently cultivate the sciences, study closely the scripture of nature, and worship, I quote, in the vast cathedral of the universe under heaven's canopy, the great Spirit who shines everywhere, unquote. At a more practical level, Sen played a very important role in the establishment of the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science, IACS, which was the first major indigenous agency for the promotion of modern science in India. This was started by the physician Mahendralal Sarkar, to whom I'll come back in a short while. Keshub Sen helped Sarkar substantially in the initial stages of the IACS project by securing donations from very many wealthy benefactors. Also, the columns of his newspapers like the Indian Mirror and the Shulab Chamachar, both were readily allowed to be used for propagating the cause of the IACS. Mahendralal Sarkar, in his turn, was himself someone who attached great importance to science as a religious and moral agent. It is also important to note that he was actually one of the early products of modern scientific higher education. He was a physician who graduated from the Calcutta Medical College, established in 1835. Apart from his medical practice, he evinced very keen interest in the general propagation of the taste for modern science among the larger public. Sarkar's espousal of modern science was not only for its obvious benefits, both mental and material, but also for a moral dimension he saw in it. In fact, he referred to the latter as the main driving force behind his endeavors. He seriously nurtured a faith in the capability of the physical sciences to act as a firm and solid basis of the development and regeneration of man's moral and spiritual nature. Science, in studying the laws of nature, revealed God's presence and action in the world as a unifying force and guarantor of order. In seeing the works and laws of God as operating in the world, I quote, the mind totters, becomes utterly overpowered, and falls prostrate in humble adoration, unquote. For Sarkar, the study of the physical universe strengthened the faith about the unity and uniformity in nature, which, being rightly interpreted, also meant, I quote, the faithfulness of the Creator to His creatures, unquote. Sarkar too saw the study of the physical sciences as leading to a purer form of faith that would be shorn of all superstitions, as he was firm that superstition of any form could never exist alongside the knowledge of physical sciences. Thus, we see at one level Sarkar looking at science beyond the material and mental pleasures that it can yield, and at another level seeking to see religion too in a refined form so that there can be a fruitful and enriching coexistence of the two in any individual. He sees one as reinforcing rather than challenging the other. Moving on to another early scientist, we have Pramatanath Bose, the famous geologist, who spent considerable amount of his time and intellectual resources on issues related to the culture of modern science and the need for greater spirituality. Bose squarely addressed the problem of science without spirituality and identified the key problem of modern culture as being centrally constituted by the pervasive influence of science and, I quote, pervasive influences of science and industrialism with less emphasis on the matters of spirit, unquote. Modern culture, according to Bose, sought to accomplish the well-being of man merely by material developments and by the gratification of his desires. Bose was very critical of the very notion of progress that was being so zealously advocated. He saw the new notion of progress as a kind of cult which drew the blind adherence of its followers. He went to the extent of saying that while the iconoclasm of modern science had destroyed many idols, it has raised many ones in its place, new ones in its place, with progress being one of them. Bose was careful enough to not attribute all search for luxury to the modern ethos. He admitted that human civilization had always tended towards luxury, but the difference, according to him, was that in earlier times, the pursuit of luxury was tempered by, I quote, the persistent propagation of the cult of renunciation and the restraint of religion, unquote. Whereas, under the aegis of modernity, I quote, the dissemination of the cult of sense gratification by the unrestricted application of science to industry and the loosening of the bonds of religion have now made men even more pleasure-loving than before, unquote. The social and moral fabric had been adversely affected because of this disjunction. In a rather cynical vein, Bose described modern life as being undoubtedly fuller, but, unquote, I quote, fuller of material wants, of things which produce Sisyphean misery and disquiet, engendered by unsatisfied desire, insatiable greed, and perpetual discord, unquote. Writing in the early decades of the 20th century itself, Bose complained of the gradual vanishing of the ideal home life and, I quote, the rapid and continuous increase in divorces, in crimes, in armaments, in strikes and riots, in insanity and in such fell diseases as tuberculosis, appendicitis, diabetes, venereal diseases, and nervous disorders of various kinds, all these being strange commentaries of the fuller life of the present day, unquote. The evil effects of this ethos pertain not only to life in the West, but inevitably extended to the rest of the world through its other attributes like militarism, search for external market, capital, labor, etc. According to Bose, the greatest triumphs of modern science, the steam engine, electric telegraph, chemical manufactures, etc., had given to, I quote, industrialism, capitalism, mammonism, and militarism, which are the four wheels of the gigantic Jagannath cart of the goddess of modern culture, which is being exultingly and recklessly drawn amid the huzzas of zealous votaries, punctuated by the pyrotechnic performances of howitzers, zeppelins, and submarines, crushing large numbers of the weak and the unwary, wherever it passes on its triumphant but aimless march, unquote. The mad scramble and international rivalries naturally led to greater militarism in Europe and, quote, rebarbarization, unquote. For Bose, unless science was freed from, I quote, unholy and fatuous union with commercialism, there would be no end to Western militarism, and that all attempts to establish peace on an enduring basis would be utterly fructuous. Bose strongly felt that India should not blindly follow the path of the West, which had, I quote, conquered the forces of nature only to be a slave of the forces which that conquest has created, unquote. The marvelous and manifold inventions, instead of lightening the struggle for existence, have tended rather to make it more acute, more prolonged, more widespread, and more debasing, according to Bose. Bose summarized his position on the sad state of affairs relating to modern culture in one profound statement. I quote, there is much science, but not much philosophy, much learning, but not much wisdom, unquote. Having highlighted some of the sharp tirades against the spirit in which science and technology were used, one should, however, underline the fact that Pramodanath Bose was also someone who had tremendous faith in modern science as an agent of economic development, and the advancement of human race. Science, clearly to him, was not just for intellectual edification, but also for the material well-being of man. He spent a considerable part of his time and energy towards the spread of science and scientific education and industrial development. As part of the Swadeshi movement, he was one of the founders of the National Council of Education, which aimed at providing indigenous and alternative modes of education as opposed to those provided by the colonial establishment. He was also instrumental in the founding of the Bengal Technical Institute in 1906, which later in 1929 became the Jadavpur College of Engineering and Technology. Similarly, Bose labored to contribute to industries too, as he essentially believed that, I quote, no community can advance on the path of civilization without industries, capital, and a certain amount of desire for the accumulation of wealth, unquote. Thus, in Bose, we see someone who, while juxtaposing science and development, did not nevertheless remove deeper human issues from the paradigm of development. The huge challenge for us to realize is a condition where, according to Bose, there were, I quote, industries without industrialism, capital without capitalism, and desire to accumulate wealth without mammonism, unquote. Prafulla Chandra Ray was yet another product of modern Western education. He was a chemist who had obtained his doctorate from the University of Edinburgh and who taught at the Presidency College and at the University College of Science, Calcutta. Behind all this lurked a deeply religious and ascetic figure. Ray belonged to a family of strong Brahmo Samaj adherents, and he readily acknowledged the influence of the Brahmo reformers like Akshay Datta and Keshav Sen in his own choice of a scientific vocation. Sharing the Brahmo Samaj's idea of degeneration and inertia in Indian society, he advocated both the reformation of religious practices and the cultivation of the new learning offered by the West. However, Ray did not buy the essentialist argument that India was predominantly a metaphysical nation. He underlined that the cultivation of physical science was not entirely neglected in the ancient days, and India had never really been under the total domination of the ancient scriptures and rituals. Over a period of time, excessive rituals and polytheism had overshadowed that spirit, according to Ray. That he was also wary of the fact that even under the British educational system, there was excessive production of lawyers and clerks as opposed to men of science. He deplored the fact that Bengalis had, I quote, practically degenerated into a race of quill drivers, unquote, and thus had, I quote, prostituted one of the noblest gifts of God, namely the thirst for knowledge, unquote. Whereas, if the Bengali distinguished himself in the field of researches and scientific investigations and in organizing industries, he will, I quote, soon have his place in the comity of nations and thus fulfill the will of God, unquote. So thus we see Ray seeing the pursuit of science as a proper use of the gift of God and also as fulfilling the will of God. He also insisted that the pursuit of science should be marked with spirituality so that it tempered that pursuit. Ray, like Pramatanath Bose, was deeply concerned at the excessively materialistic direction taken by Western science and technology. He fondly hoped that India would play a very important role in redressing this ailment of humankind, and that by her cultivation of both religion and science in right degree and proportion, she would effect, I quote, a fruitful synthesis of the two spirits, for in their synthesis lay a new hope for the world, unquote. It is to be noted that Ray was also an entrepreneur, a very successful one, as seen in his starting and successful running of the Bengal Chemical and Pharmaceutical Works. Thus again we see in Ray, as in Pramatanath Bose, someone who, while being interested in development, in science, in industries, yet did not lose sight of the need to temper them all with something larger and deeper than all of them. raised such concern was shared by his colleague and fellow scientist Jagdish Chandra Bose, who was trained at St. Xavier's College and at the University of London and here at Cambridge. Bose was a student of Father Lafont, a Jesuit priest who taught physics at St. Xavier's College, Calcutta. Father Lafont was a great source of support to Mahendralal Sarkar in the IACS endeavor, and he also did considerable work towards popularization of science through his public lectures with demonstrations. In college, he had kindled J.C. Bose's interest in a scientific career and his forays into physics. But Bose's deep Brahmo connection and his faith in the essential unity of all existence took him to border areas of science, whereby he tried to find similarities among plants, other living beings, and the inorganic world. It is important to see how here his religious orientation, that's the Vedantic view which looks at the essential unity of all things, had a very direct influence on his actual practice of science. More generally, Bose believed that the spiritual bent of mind, rather than being detrimental to the pursuit of science, would in fact come to its aid, countering the proposition that the Indian mind, by its very peculiar constitution, would always turn away from nature to metaphysical speculations. Bose argued that the Indian bent of mind, with its imagination tempered by meditation, was suited for a more comprehensive approach to modern science. Bose also appealed to the actual accomplishments of the past and to India's long intellectual traditions. He even undertook spiritual, inspirational visits to ancient seats of learning like Nalanda and Taxila, whose glorious memories fired the ambition of his youth. Thus, the life and career of one of the first modern scientists of India was not only suffused and inspired by religion, but his very scientific work, outlook, and even choice of research area itself was touched by his religious fervor and concern about a purely materialistic scientific culture. The discourse on the relationship between science and religion in early periods of modern science in India was taken to a new height in the person of Swami Vivekananda. While Swami Vivekananda's exhortations on the spiritual awakening of India, reawakening of India are well known, it is not very commonly known that he was involved in the advancement of scientific learning and culture at some practical levels. He was one of the staunchest supporters of Sarkar in his IACS mission, and in fact personally attended some of its meetings and lectures. He also taught one of his disciples, the Maharaja of Khetri, the uses of telescope and microscope. Also, perhaps inspired by Father Lafont's example, Vivekananda advised one of his disciples to raise some funds to buy some magic lanterns, globes, maps, chemicals, etc., and to gather crowds every evening where they could be lectured to on religion first and then instructed in some matters of science. Most importantly, Vivekananda played a very lasting role on the scientific face of India by encouraging Jamshedji Tata in founding the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, arguably the most prolific institute of scientific research in India today. But with all his admiration for modern science, Vivekananda was not one who would be dazzled at the wonders of modern science. He rather exhorted his followers to go beyond it and establish the supremacy of the spirit over science and its promises. Vivekananda opined that certain amount of materialism was in fact essential, especially for ordinary men for whom renunciation does not come easily. He felt that they should enjoy the world to an extent, after which only they should be expected to rise to spiritual heights. But he was unequivocal in his stand that ultimately it was spiritualism which had to have an upper hand after acquiring all that could be acquired through materialism and science. This was particularly necessary considering the evils that one saw due to the march of the excessive materialism in the West. He insisted that spirituality and religion should continue to be the main source of India's vitality, I quote, the fountains which will have to overflow and flood the world to bring in new life and new vitality to the Western and other nations, unquote. He warned that if India left spirituality aside to go after the materializing civilization of the West, the backbone of the nation would be broken and the net result would be annihilation. He felt that along with modern science, one had many other things to learn and acquire from the West, like modern methods of organization, management of affairs, etc. But the true strength lay in the subordination of his knowledge of European sciences and learning of his wealth, position, and name, and all of that to spirituality. However, in due course, as we move towards the 1930s and 40s, one sees a considerable shift being effected by the very students and close associates of P.C. Ray and J.C. Bose, students such as Satyendranath Bose, S.N. Bose, and Meghnad Saha and others, who are more interested, apart from their scientific works as such, in aspects like greater popularization of science through vernacular and the role of science in nation building. They did not see any major role for religion in their science, either as an inspiration or as a metaphysic. Satyendranath Bose, claiming to speak generally for scientists, held that a scientist would find the scriptures, philosophy, and even religion inconsequential for his work. However, according to him, the thinking and self-confidence required to pursue science and use it for the alleviation of man's pain did not necessarily imply that everyone has to become an atheist. What he advocated was simply that the world had changed a lot from the heydays of Indian prosperity and abundance, and people had to work out ways and means which were in tune with the current situations and problems. This in turn meant that it was futile to look for solution in old modes of thinking. As each century throws up new problems to a nation, people had to rise to the occasion in an appropriate way. It is not that the scientists did not concern themselves or do not grasp the ultimate realities and the mysteries of creation. They do, perhaps not with the same felicity of a philosopher. For a scientist, according to Bose, religious practice alone can achieve very little. Deep philosophical questions and religious doctrine as to man's place in the universe and relationship to the rest of the world were all to be private matters. Bose concedes that from such a discourse, man may draw inspiration for work, but once he begins to work, he must work with his whole mind in action. However, Bose himself did not want to be seen as a scientist who approached science on purely pragmatic grounds and looking only on its mundane utilitarian side and holding that science had nothing spiritual about it. While insisting on the place and value of science in the economy of social needs, he confesses that it was not even for a moment his aim to draw any line of distinction between the spiritual and the material. After all, it is not the universe alone, but human life too, that is one whole. We do it harm and injury by dissecting it. He also was convinced of the essentially liberating influence of the scientific spirit and the profoundly humanizing tone of its investigation. But the catch here was what Bose saw as spiritual. In an interesting twist, he proclaimed that, I quote, "Insofar as science is ministering to the economic and social needs of the human race, it is really working out its deep spiritual purpose," unquote. Thus, we come to a situation where science itself has become God and development the new religion. By now, on the background, the political landscape was undergoing tremendous transformation. By the 1920s, the freedom struggle had picked up great momentum, and by 1930s, one could see early intimations or expectations of freedom, so much so that the Indian elite set themselves upon the task of carving the shape of the future nation. By this time, the colonial state also had showcased in convincing manners the great potentials of modern science and technology in various domains, from railways to industries to irrigation and communication. On the global theatre, one saw Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, marked by emphasis on large-scale infrastructure building and dam constructions, and the emergence of Soviet Russia with its idea of state planning. These were of immediate and particular relevance to the development debate, and they did not fail to captivate the Indian intelligentsia. This new ethos was most reflected in the life, work, and ideas of Meghnad Saha. Saha, far from being overtly religious and making religious allusions to his scientific work, in fact, earned the ire of the orthodox for his very unorthodox and forthright views and writings, for whom his work was his supreme god. Science, by and large, was about using man's talents to harness the resources of nature for development. He believed in taming the rivers through large-scale dam construction works and in large-scale industrialization. The Science and Culture group that he launched and its journal of the same name since 1935 led a frontal attack on Gandhian ideas of small-scale and village industries. Gandhian economic visions were rubbished as backward-looking ways. For Saha and his followers, what was needed was a proper and intensive application of science to solve, I quote, our bewildering economic, social, and even political problems, unquote. Another member of the Science and Culture group, J.C. Ghosh, came down on those powerful leaders, I quote, who were so impressed by the evils of the modern world that they were opposed to attempts at the use of state power to science and technology. Therefore, men of science, apart from contributing to the use of science for development, also had to undertake the additional burden of, I quote, educating their masters out of such conservative views, unquote. He acknowledged that science could be misused, but it would be a force of immense good if handled for the benefit of humanity. He summoned the weight and authority of Louis Pasteur to declare, in Pasteur's words, that, I quote, science is the soul of all progress and the soul of all prosperity, unquote. Subhash Chandra Bose, I think this is the fourth of the Boses we are talking today, added his own strong voice to seal the rising stature of modern science and the unidirectional developmental paradigm by declaring that, I quote, we younger folks approach the task of nation building in a thoroughly scientific spirit, and we desire to be armed with all the knowledge which modern science and culture can afford us, irrespective of whatever might have been the views of our older nation builders. He enthusiastically voiced his support to the ideas and writings of the Science and Culture group. During his presidentship of the Indian National Congress, the National Planning Committee, an entity mooted by Saha, was formed in 1938, and this marked a very significant step towards the cause of harnessing high science and technology for nation building. Thus, we see a clear difference here in this generation vis-a-vis the earlier ones. The early men of science and public intellectuals saw God in science, saw cosmic order in science, saw some moral potential in science, but the next generation saw more money out of science, development out of science, and other such things, and they're talking more about science and nation building purely on a materialistic angle. And today, as we face some of the grim consequences of the march of modern science and technology, and of the obsession with a monochromatic idea of progress, one has to ponder as to whether a promising trajectory inaugurated or advocated by P.N. Bose, J.C. Bose, P.C. Ray, and Mahendralal Sarkar, and supported by men like Swami Vivekananda, had been unfortunately lost or diverted. These men were as much committed to development as anyone else. They were also as aware of the potentials of science as anyone else of that era. As explicitly demonstrated, both in their ideas as well as their practical works and contributions, one wonders as to where and why the need arose to sideline the spiritual dimension. This, in spite of the towering presence of Mahatma Gandhi, who precisely warned against that path. Even if one had disagreements with him on the question of practicability of small technologies and rural industries, one could still have heeded to his call to be careful about ignoring the spiritual, moral, and the ethical dimensions in the developmental debate. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions arising from that, so they want to pick up with a question. Please, yes.
Do you have an answer to your last question?
No, I'm still wondering. Because actually there was no need, because as we say, it's not like the earlier scientists compromised in the quality of their work or the practical works they did. So I see absolutely no need for the later generations to be apologetic or to necessarily have to shelve concerns with the past or with the other sides of science. I just wonder why and how that happened. I'm still exploring.
Please, yes.
I was struck by your, well, not your, the comment that the early scientists wanted to subsume science into their spirituality and keep the moral and spiritual dimension intact. Well, the bulk of religion in India at the moment is Hinduism, and obviously there are a lot of Muslims. So which religion did those particular scientists adhere to?
Oh yeah, these were all of them belong to Hinduism, and in fact they belong to the socio-religious reform movement. The Brahmo Samaj was trying to basically reform Hinduism, especially they were worried about the superstitions, the cult practices and the other things. So they saw this reform movement itself as another way of curing the pitch for modern science. So basically the answer to your question is Hindu-based.
Could I just follow up on that? So what was the response of the Islamic community in 19th century, sort of early colonialism? I mean, can you cite examples in those days of fine, Islamic scientists coming forward in the same way that you just have for more the Hindu background scientists?
Of course, I haven't done much in my work, but as David was pointing out in our discussions for the mathematician, then there was, of course, so Syed Ahmad Khan was a notable Muslim intellectual who tried to promote Western science, and maybe David can add to that.
Dennis, you want to comment on that? Yes.
I think you're quite right. Syed Ahmad Khan was remarkable, not as a scientist working in a laboratory, but for creating the kind of approach to Islam where science and Islam complement one another. He created that kind of culture which enabled Muslim scientists to move forward, so much so that the physicist, although he's called a Pakistani, in fact, he was born in India, Abdus Salam was the Nobel Prize winning physicist. And Mohammed Iqbal talked about Einstein's theories as Einstein's new vision of the universe. This is Islam speaking, you see. And Iqbal went on to be one of the founding fathers of Pakistan. Unfortunately, we don't hear about that now because there's been something of a conservative reaction in Islam, and the Aligarh Muslim school, which Syed Ahmad Khan founded, and was a brilliant, flourishing cultural and religious centre. The conservatives moved in, and it's become quite different now. So there has been that sort of reaction. So we don't hear about the great things that Syed Ahmad Khan, Mohammed Iqbal and the others were capable of at that time.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Overhead, please, yes.
Have you come across the work of Andrew Sartori at all? Because he's a, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with his views, but his interpretation of the move from sort of Swadeshi figures like Gandhi, who believe strongly in the sort of spiritual and cultural dimension against this idea of, you know, monolithic Western materialism, that the underlying motivation behind that was a sort of trying to find this spiritual and cultural realm in which they could, in which the Hindus could sort of claim a certain kind of freedom and self-authorship in a colonial context. But once that colonial context had passed on, there was no longer such a need to have that spiritual dimension in the same way. So you had then a figure like Nehru, who just isn't that interested in religion anymore, and sees sort of a Soviet Union model of scientific materialism as the way to go. Could you comment on that? Is that?
No, that is problematic because as we see, so this is still the British still there. So it's happening early from 1910, 1920. So we see Mehmet Sahan, S.N. Bose coming. I think that's not something particular to do with the British or even the intimations of their leaving. So I think insofar as the intimations of freedom is concerned, I think it's only related in terms of their preparation to guide the nation and how to do it and the place of science in that. I don't think, unless it happened like after 1947, then I don't think that holds good.
Please. Yes.
I'm conscious of the recent talk we've had about Islam and science and the parallels in what you've said about how both of them are critical of the spiritual emptiness of our Western scientific tradition. But in the East, one of the contrasts with our view of spirituality is reincarnation. And there's anecdotal evidence, if not scientific evidence, that seems to be fairly interesting. I met a chap, he's called Andrew, something Cremo anyway, and he's a Hare Krishna devotee and sponsored by them, and I've got 2 fat volumes where he's gone back through the paleontological records looking for anomalies which might allow for the presence of humans in parallel to Darwinian evolution, which could be consistent with the Vedas and so forth. I was just wondering whether you felt any general consciousness of these ideas, and maybe we could look forward to them. I mean, in the sense that, you know, the other apes are perhaps more of a degenerate relative of ours than we have evolved from them. I don't know if it makes sense to you.
In fact, in my studies, when I was inquiring to these intellectuals, there is clear, there are references to evolution and the possible challenges that the Darwinian theory might pose. And quite interestingly, so these very people, in fact, Mahendra Sarkar has written a bit on that, said like, we in the East need not be worried at all because we are always used to mythical forms of evolution. So he said he was wondering like why the West is so upset by Darwin's theory. So all the references that I came across, they weren't too worried about the challenges of Darwin's theory.
Questions? Yes, please. Yes.
Apart from science in shaping up religious belief in India, do you think is there any contribution from politics, especially from southern India, where the Dravidian movement is much more prominent and it stays basically on the atheism?
Okay, so that's kind of more contemporary or like from the 1930s. I don't think that they've been so effective in taking religion out of people's lives. Of course, they have been more effective on social egalitarianism, but I don't think, in fact, they themselves are finding it difficult to get out of religious, in fact, some of the more superstitious forms of religion. So I don't think that their brand of atheism has in any major way removed people from religion, and I don't think they have contributed much to the question of science and religion equation. Yeah.
Why most of your scientists are from the West Bengal part of India? Why not? Have you?
Oh yeah. So as I
famous personalities like M.G.K. Menon and Swaminathan from southern India.
Of course, yeah. So the straightforward answer to that is my area of research has been generally on Bengal, because my next project was to be not only towards south, but also to look at more non-elite resources. So especially in the vernacular. So that also brings me south in my next projects, where I'll be going into writings in Tamil by more non-elite, and of course I'll also be covering the Dravidian writers too. So that's the reason. So right now my work is on Bengal.
Please, yes.
Yeah, does the central government in India direct any scientific curriculum for the schools? And I was thinking recently about a school called the Deobandi School, which is a Muslim school, where the curriculum hasn't changed since 1858, after the First War of Freedom, or whatever you'd like to call it, the mutiny. Can you say anything about that? I mean, like Deobandi School, I mean, it's got this curriculum which hasn't changed at all.
Yeah. So your question was whether the Indian central
The
government.
central government looks at what they're teaching in science.
How much is the central government control of the whole Indian educational system? I think that's the question, isn't it? Yes.
I wouldn't know too much on that, but certainly it's not that case. I think if not entirely up to date, I think from time to time they see to that it's not that bad. But I should say that I'm not too well versed scientific policy as such.
I think there's quite a bit of local state freedom, isn't there? If I understand.
Yeah,
it.
education
Other
is.
people might know more, but
Yeah.
my understanding is there's some centralization, but actually it's state. The state has most educational control. Is
Yeah,
that
that's right.
That's
Yeah.
probably right.
Including the universities. And
Yes.
of course, the universities themselves are controlled by the UGC. And of course, now the present government is working for a umbrella institution which will cover all central agencies like UGC, CSIR, or All India Educational Authority or whatever. It's still in the making. But as you rightly say, education is still at state's elite.
Please. Yes.
But to answer that, I don't know all the details of how the Indian government works, but some of the senior scientists have persuaded the Indian government to put a lot of money into science education. And they're building, I think, 6 new science universities from the ground, spread geographically around the country so everyone gets a whack. And they're trying to integrate undergraduate teaching with research, so the students see frontline research as they go through the undergraduate system.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
they may or may not be successful. I mean, they're very much in their infancy at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the complaints against the set of institutes, one of which I represent, the Indian Institute of Technology, the problem with that, it's, as it rightly says, the Indian Institutes of Technology, which in fact attracted the best brains, and the problem was that, in fact, there's a problem with the name, so they say it's neither Indian nor nor does it do much technology. So most of the students go to the US on all kinds of other jobs and thing. But the main thing is they realize that pure science has been left in the lurch, except for the Indian Institute of Science, which was in fact till last year was only a postgraduate research institute. So they realized this problem a couple of years back, and the set of institutions they started is the ISER, Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research. So it's basically like IITs which were spread geographically different areas. So we have different ISERs, IASERs. So it is basically to promote, to catch them in at the undergraduate level. So it's like BTechs and IITs. So we have undergraduate and integrated courses. So that's one of the new initiatives to promote pure science. You're right.
Please, yes.
I just wondered how religious denominations have evolved since as scientific education has spread throughout
Sorry?
Is there a correlation between the expansion of scientific education and the development of new sects or new branches of religion?
Oh yeah, so that's an interesting question. In fact, I was having an interesting discussion just before this talk. Very interestingly, like the spread of science or the institutions of technology or any of these things seem to have hardly any effect on the actual practice of science and the general people's are even in fact sometime in the 80s Indira Gandhi famously complained that her scientists were suffering from severe schizophrenia. That is, they were good scientists in the lab, all was fine, they were sending their rockets and all that. But then once they are back home, they still look for the, in fact, it's even said how far it, I don't know how far it is true, like even for launching the rocket, it seems they consult the astrologer for the appropriate auspicious time. So I think it's fairly true, but then at least in their private lives, so they follow all the rituals, all those things which are termed as superstition. That's at the level of the mainstream scientists itself. I can guarantee that these institutions or the research, like people are absolutely happy. Like if you want to model the model that would best fit the Indian general public scenario is that, okay, that's fine, this fine, the two different spheres, and entirely happy with it. So it's not like my science will terribly affect my religious beliefs or pursuits or the new. In fact, we have seen more and more sects coming out more and more as in the West. So that has not in any way affected the, as I told him, like so just as the atheist movement has not made any serious dent. So science definitely has not, at least these people would have made a few people atheists, but science education or spread of science has definitely not had any dent on religion at the popular level at least. Yeah.
What's the position of women in science? I haven't heard much mention.
Oh yeah, so that's again a question of raging debate. So it's what's the term I would use? I think pathetic would not be a bad term. For instance, even in admissions to an institution like ours at the Indian Institute of Technology, like we hardly have 6 or 7% girls. So it's 93 to 7. And at the general research, of course, a lot of people have done research, they've done surveys and all that. So on average, it's like 10 to 15%. This is 85% men in the mainstream scientific laboratories and institutions. In IITs, it's really bad. 7 is.
Are you talking here about what we say faculty or staff members, or are you talking about the whole general scientific community?
No, including faculty members and premier institutions and scientific labs and organizations.
Right. One has to say, without mentioning names, it's pretty pathetic in some institutes in this country as well. So, since you used that word, you know, I would like to just make that point as we go along. Yes, please, David. So, yeah.
Could I just pick up on that gentleman's question about the sort of historical assumptions, because there is a whole school of historical thought in India, particularly in the north, the subaltern school of history, which is that whenever I or you speak in English and quote from people like Swami Vivekananda and the other reformers, we are basing our understanding of history on assumptions, linguistic assumptions, and really promoting a very culturally colonial point of view. And by these people spoke Vivekananda and Ramaram Roy, they spoke brilliantly in English. But the accusation is that in the process they were fostering a sort of European culture that is alien and destructive to the real India. And people like Max Muller were also promoting this, and also Christian undertones and all the rest. There's a half-truth in this, but in a sense it's inevitable, because most people can't manage fluently more than 2 or 3 or 4 languages.
Yes.
And to do this historical research properly, you have to know 35 or more. So, you know, there's a real difficulty here. But the positive side, I think, we were discussing earlier, is that we need to have researchers, funded researchers, with these other languages, Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Maratha. Bengal has been covered quite well, doing the research, and probably would come up with some very, very creative and interesting complementary understandings to what you've been saying. But in as far as what is humanly possible, I mean, do you agree with this?
That's right, because I fully agree that this has this problem that we present a particular worldview, and but as we were discussing, I think one of the most feasible solutions is to have a consortium of people. But as you rightly said, like we can't hopefully learn 30-40 languages. I think it's best to have a consortium of people who speak native particular languages and go into the local material, so that we get more of the non-mainstream, non-elitist views, and also to look back into history to some of the non-written sources here. So I think a lot of oral history also has to be done. So I think language definitely is a problem. I think all of this comes filtered not only through the English language, but through the very system of education, to which not only Vivekananda but including me, so come to, so that is definitely there. It's a historical problem, but we can try to minimize the effect of it by this kind of going into the vernacular originals.
The thinking behind there was an 1835 Act, the England Act, which imposed tertiary education to be taught in English. And the thinking behind that from the colonialists was very much in terms of providing access to Western scientific publications, but also squashing some of the the metaphysical type of thought that belonged to Hinduism. And but your presentation really didn't look at the relationship between what the colonialists were doing and what the Hindu scientists themselves were doing. And I wondered if you saw that act and things done after that as being helpful or not helpful.
Oh yeah, so in fact that has been covered in some length in my thesis. So in fact Macaulay, the author of it, very famously said we have to create a class of men who are Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes and manners, which I think was considerably achieved, but because they had, I think, they were able to pull along for 2 centuries by and large because of that, considerable success in that. But coming to this specific question of there was a cultural game going on, so as part of so that was one of the, apart from divide and rule and these kind of strategies, one of the other strategies was to make the Indians feel inferior by the superiority of the knowledge. One of the most important constituents was modern science. The interesting part of that battle was Indians did not buy that idea. Okay, fine, they agreed that there was a problem, that Indians had fallen behind. They consistently, in fact, that rhymes well with the imagery that Joseph Needham had built, that science is a general stream running as a big pool of ocean, and different streams are contributed at different times. So Indians were striking back, saying like, no, when you didn't have language, when you didn't have systems in place, so we had algebra, we had trigonometry and things like that. So it's not like we are inherently incapable of doing science. So we had our mistakes, we somewhere lost the race, and of course now it so happens that in this particular phase of science, so they consistently try to remove the label of Western from modern. So it was science, okay, this is a modern phase of science, to which, okay, history has entrusted you to take care in a more substantial way, and we are not far behind. And we belong to a race which had done it in the past, and we need not feel inferior except that we missed the race here. But so they didn't buy into that. essentialism. So that way the British thing did not work, and after then the rest is history. So the catching up game is still on, and then in some areas the overtaking has also happened. So yeah.
Okay, well I think we'll have to draw a close there, and let's really thank Dr. Lourdusamy very much for a fascinating talk. So thank you.